Two thugs laughed as they booted Andrea's wheelchair off the canyon edge, convinced the fall would bury their dirty secrets forever. But her scream didn't die in the wind. It pierced the silence just as the territory's most ruthless crime boss was driving by in a black Escalade. He didn't just pull her back from the void, he decided that gravity needed to claim the ones who pushed her. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. Help me, please help me. The scream tore through the desert canyon just as the steel-toed boot connected with Andrea Ramon's wheelchair. Dust exploded like a shotgun blast. The chair tipped forward, wheels spinning uselessly in open air, and Andrea's hands flew up, grasping at nothing as gravity swallowed her whole. Behind her, laughter, cold, casual. The kind of laughter that comes easy to men who've never paid for anything. For weeks, they'd watched her, followed her, whispered threats that no one else would hear. But no one could imagine their cruelty would crescendo into murder. Just as Andrea plummeted toward the jagged rocks below, a sound ripped through the stillness: engine roar, gravel spray, and the arrival of a man who didn't ask questions before delivering answers. In the forgotten canyon town of Tierra Roja, mercy wasn't a virtue, it was a transaction Andrea Ramon could never afford. Her wheelchair rolled through the cracked dirt streets, the rubber tires whispering against stone, carved smooth by 100 years of wind and poverty. Tierra Roja was a place built into the rock itself, where the wealthy lived above and the forgotten lived below, where your worth was measured by how far you could climb and how easily you could be pushed. Andrea, 17, Latina, paralyzed from the knees down, existed in the margins they didn't even bother to name. Her dark eyes were always moving, always calculating exits that might not exist. She wore survival the way others wore, confidence like armor too thin to stop what was coming but too necessary to abandon. She'd made it to the Overlook that evening before they found her. The two men materialized from the dust like bad memories given flesh. The one on the left, thick-necked, denim vest open over tattooed arms, boots heavy enough to break bone, grinned with teeth too white for someone who did such dirty work. Mateo Ruiz carried himself like a man who understood that violence was just another language the town spoke fluently. The other leaner, meaner, a scar splitting his eyebrow like a question mark circled behind Andrea's chair, with the casual predation of someone who'd done this before. Javier Soto. His knuckles were permanently scabbed, and his eyes held the empty warmth of a snake digesting its last meal. "You lost, Mija?" Mateo's voice was gravel mixed with mockery, the kind of tone that made kindness feel like a threat. Javier bent low, close enough that Andrea could smell the cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. His hand rested on the back of her wheelchair, not pushing yet, just there. "A promise. We saw you the other night," Javier said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sitting here, listening. You know what happens to people who hear things they shouldn't." Andrea's jaw tightened. She met Mateo's eyes, defiant even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I didn't hear anything." Mateo's grin widened, cruel and certain. "That's the thing about wheels, chica. They don't leave tracks when they fly." He nodded to Javier. Before Andrea could scream, before she could brace, Javier shoved her chair toward the edge. Hard. The wheels caught loose stone, momentum doing what gravity demanded, and Andrea lurched forward, hands scrambling for brake levers that no longer mattered. Mateo's boot came next. One kick. Steel-toed, precise. The impact rang through metal and bone. Andrea's world tilted vertical. Sky became ground. Ground became nothing. Her scream, raw, animal, desperate, exploded from her chest as the wheelchair tipped over the canyon's edge. Time fractured. She saw the rust-colored rock face streaking past. Felt the chair spinning beneath her, straps biting into her waist. Heard the wind swallowing her voice even as she kept screaming because stopping meant accepting and accepting meant dying. The chair hit first. Metal shrieked against stone. The frame twisted, one wheel shattering on impact, the other spinning free into the void. Andrea was thrown sideways, her shoulder slamming into jagged rock that tore through her jacket like paper. Pain white-hot, immediate bloomed across her ribs. She clawed at the cliffside, fingernails splitting against stone, palms shredding as she grasped for anything solid. Her body slid another 3 feet before her right hand caught something, a twisted root jutting from a crack in the rock face. She stopped. Barely. Andrea dangled there, suspended between earth and emptiness, her feet swinging over nothing, her weight pulling against muscles that screamed in protest. Blood ran warm down her forearms. Her chest heaved, each breath a knife between her ribs. Below her, the canyon floor waited, patient, certain. Above her, Mateo and Javier's silhouettes leaned over the edge, dark shapes against the burnt orange sky. "Damn," Javier said, almost impressed. She caught something. Not for long. Mateo turned away, already bored. "Canyon'll finish it." Their footsteps crunched through gravel, fading toward wherever men like them disappeared to when their work was done. Andrea tried to pull herself up. Failed. Her arms trembled violently. The root groaned under her weight. She could feel it loosening, threads of wood separating from stone grain by grain. She screamed again. Not words this time, just sound, pure terror given voice. The scream echoed across the canyon walls, bouncing between stone faces, carrying farther than it should have, reaching places screams weren't meant to reach. And somewhere in the distance, an engine cut silent. Andrea hung there, bleeding and broken, her hands slipping millimeter by millimeter, waiting for the root to give or her strength to fail, whichever came first. She closed her eyes, prayed to gods she'd stopped believing in, and heard, impossibly, the sound of boots on stone coming closer. Not from above, from below. Andrea's fingers had been slipping for 3 minutes when the boots arrived, but her mind had been falling for 17 years. 6 days earlier, Andrea Ramon learned early that the world was built for people who could walk away from trouble. She couldn't walk, so she learned to disappear instead. Tierra Roja didn't have a high school, just a concrete building that doubled as a community center on weekends and a polling station during elections. The classrooms smelled like chalk dust and resignation. 23 students total, grades 9 through 12, all of them children of miners, cooks, or ghosts. Andrea sat in the back corner by the window, not because she chose it, but because it was the only spot her wheelchair fit without blocking the aisle. Miss Delgado taught history like she was reading a eulogy. The other students passed notes, carved initials into desks, counted down the minutes until they could leave and never come back. Nobody looked at Andrea, not in cruelty, in absence. She was furniture, a fixture, part of the room's architecture that you navigated around without acknowledging. When the lunch bell rang, students flooded toward the door like water finding cracks. Andrea waited. She always waited, letting the stampede pass, giving herself space to maneuver through doorways designed for bodies that bent differently than hers. She rolled toward the courtyard, where most kids ate on wooden benches under a rusted awning. Andrea took her usual spot alone, near the far wall, where the shade fell longest and the conversations never reached. She unwrapped the tortilla her aunt had made that morning. Still warm, still soft, small mercies. That's when she heard them. 2 voices, low and urgent, drifting from behind the maintenance shed. Andrea's spot was tucked just around the corner, close enough to hear, far enough to be forgotten. Thursday night, 11 sharp. Mateo's voice, unmistakable even in whisper. "How much this time?" Javier asked. "Enough to make the drive worth it. Crates are already marked. Routes the same through the overlook, down past the mission ruins, straight to the depot. And Vega's people? They don't ask questions long as the count's right." Andrea's hand froze halfway to her mouth. She knew those names. Everyone in Tierra Roja knew what Vega meant. Money that moved in the dark, shipments that didn't have paperwork, problems that got solved with shovels and silence. She should have left, should have wheeled away, pretended she'd heard nothing, protected herself with the same invisibility that had kept her safe for 17 years. But her wheel caught a loose stone. The scrape was soft, barely a sound, but in that pocket of quiet, it was everything. The conversation stopped. Footsteps. Mateo appeared around the corner first, eyes narrowing when he saw her. Javier followed, arms crossed, jaw tight. "How long you been sitting there?" Mateo asked. His tone was friendly. Too friendly. The kind of friendly that came with conditions. "I just got here," Andrea said quickly. "I didn't what?" Javier stepped closer. "Didn't hear? Or didn't understand?" Andrea's pulse hammered in her throat. "I wasn't listening. I was just eating." Mateo crouched down to her eye level, smile sharp as broken glass. "See? That's the problem with wheels, Mija. You roll into places you don't belong. Hear things you shouldn't. Makes people nervous." "I won't say anything," Andrea whispered. "Yeah." Mateo stood, brushing dust off his jeans. "I believe you." He nodded to Javier, and they walked away. But Andrea saw the look they exchanged. The calculation, the decision already half made. For the next 6 days, Andrea became a ghost in her own life. She felt their eyes everywhere. In the hallway between classes, at the bodega when she bought milk for her aunt, outside the church on Sunday morning when she helped fold bulletins. Mateo and Javier were always there, not threatening, not speaking, just present. A constant reminder that they knew where she lived, where she went, who would notice if she stopped showing up. Her aunt Tia Rosa, 63, arthritic hands that still made the best tamales in town, asked once if something was wrong. Andrea said no. Because what could Rosa do? Call the police? The sheriff's office was 40 miles away and visited Tierra Roja twice a month if they remembered. Report it to someone local? Half the town worked for Vega in some capacity. The other half looked the other way. Andrea was alone. So she did what she always did. She tried to stay small, tried to be invisible, tried to believe that silence would save her. On the 6th day, Mateo's truck pulled up beside her as she rolled home from the store. Javier leaned out the passenger window, smile lazy and dangerous. Need a ride? He asked. Andrea's stomach dropped. I'm fine. Wasn't really asking, chica. Mateo got out, walked around, and grabbed the handles of her wheelchair before she could protest. He lifted her chair and all into the truck bed like she weighed nothing. Just want to talk, Mateo said, climbing back into the driver's seat. Friendly conversation. The truck drove away from town, away from the main road, toward the canyon overlook where the cell service died and the silence swallowed sound. Andrea's hands gripped the sides of her chair. She wanted to scream, but who would hear? The truck stopped at the cliff's edge. Mateo and Javier got out slowly, taking their time. And Andrea understood with cold, brutal clarity that invisibility hadn't saved her. It had just made her easier to erase. Mateo Ruiz learned 2 things from his father before the old man drank himself into an early grave: how to throw a punch that broke ribs, and how to recognize when someone couldn't fight back. The second lesson was more valuable. 3 hours before the cliff, Mateo sat in the cab of his truck outside the cantina, watching dust devils spin through the empty street. Tierra Roja looked like God's rough draft, a place sketched in, and then abandoned when something better came along. His phone buzzed. A text from Vega's lieutenant, a man whose name Mateo didn't know and didn't need to. Problem with Thursday? Mateo typed back. Handled. The lie came easy. Everything came easy when you understood the rules. And the first rule of Tierra Roja was simple. Some people mattered, and some people were weight you cut loose when the boat started sinking. Andrea Ramon was ballast. Javier emerged from the cantina, wiping beer foam from his lip, a satisfied smirk already in place. He slid into the passenger seat, bringing the smell of cheap alcohol and cheaper decisions with him. She seen us yet today? Javier asked. Rolled past an hour ago. Looked scared. Mateo started the engine. Good. Fear makes people predictable. You think she told anyone? Mateo snorted. Who's she gonna tell? That crippled girl don't got friends. Don't got family that matters. She's a ghost already, we're just making it official. Javier pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and cracked the window. Vega's gonna ask questions if shipments get interrupted. Vega's gonna get his shipments. And we're gonna get paid. Mateo turned the wheel, pointing the truck toward the edge of town. Girl overheard one conversation. She's not law. She's not muscle. She's just in the way, Javier finished. Exactly. They drove in silence for a while, the truck bouncing over ruts and potholes the town council had stopped fixing 3 mayors ago. Tierra Roja wasn't dying, it was already dead. Just hadn't stopped moving yet. Mateo thought about Andrea's face when he'd crouched in front of her 6 days ago. The fear in her eyes, the way she'd stammered her promises to stay quiet. He'd believed her, actually. But belief didn't matter when consequences did. You ever think about how easy this is? Javier asked, flicking ash out the window. What? This. All of it. Javier gestured vaguely at the landscape. We do whatever we want. Take what we need. Nobody stops us. Mateo shrugged. That's how it works when you're connected. Vega's organization runs from here to the border. Cops don't touch us. Locals don't talk. We got protection all the way up. All the way up, Javier repeated, like a prayer. Like doctrine. That protection was the foundation everything else was built on. Mateo had watched his father die broke and bitter. A man who'd worked his whole life and had nothing to show for it but scars and regrets. Mateo decided young he'd rather be the one leaving scars. Vega's network offered that. Money, respect, immunity. All you had to do was follow orders and handle problems before they became complications. Andrea was a complication. Simple math. They found her outside the bodega, loading a plastic bag into the basket attached to her wheelchair. She saw the truck and froze just for a second before pretending she hadn't. Mateo almost laughed. "Need a ride?" Javier called out, already grinning. Andrea shook her head quickly. "I'm fine. Wasn't really asking, chica." Mateo climbed out, boots hitting gravel with authority. He walked around to where Andrea sat, her hands gripping the wheels like she was about to bolt, as if she could. "Just want to talk," Mateo said, his voice reasonable. Almost kind. Friendly conversation. He grabbed the handles of her wheelchair before she could respond. Lifted. The chair wasn't heavy. Andrea weighed maybe 100 pounds soaking wet, and the frame was aluminum, built for portability. Easy. Everything about this was easy. He hoisted the chair into the truck bed, securing it against the cab. Andrea's knuckles were white against the armrests, but she didn't scream, didn't fight. Good. She was learning. Javier climbed back into the passenger seat, and Mateo slid behind the wheel. The engine rumbled to life, and they pulled away from town, heading toward the canyon road. "Where are we going?" Andrea's voice was small, carried forward by the wind. "Told you," Mateo called back. "Just gonna talk." In the rearview mirror, he watched her face. The fear was sharper now, mixed with something else. Resignation, maybe. The look of someone who'd stopped believing help would come. That look made everything simpler. "You think she's got her phone?" Javier asked quietly. Mateo checked the mirror again. Andrea's pockets were empty, her hands visible. "Don't matter. No service out here anyway." The truck climbed higher, the road narrowing, civilization falling away behind them. Out here, there were no witnesses, no cameras, no consequences. Just canyon and sky and the kind of silence that swallowed secrets whole. "You ever feel bad?" Javier asked suddenly. "About any of this?" Mateo glanced at him. "About what?" "You know, what we do." "Bad?" Mateo laughed, short and sharp. "Feel bad about taking out trash? About protecting our interests?" "Javi, this is survival. She heard something she shouldn't have. We're fixing it. That's the job." "Yeah," Javier said, but something in his voice wavered. Mateo's jaw tightened. "You going soft on me?" "No, just asking." "Then don't." Asking questions is how people end up making mistakes. The overlook appeared ahead, rust-colored stone dropping away into nothing. Mateo parked 10 feet from the edge, killed the engine, and stepped out into the desert heat. Behind him, Andrea had stopped breathing. Mateo walked to the truck bed and lowered the tailgate. "Come on," he said, pulling her chair down. "Let's talk." Andrea's hands were on fire, not metaphorically. Not the way people describe pain when they're being dramatic. This was literal nerve endings screaming, skin torn to raw meat, blood making everything slick and impossible to hold. The root groaned. She felt it shift in the rock face, felt the ancient wood fibers separating from stone one microscopic tear at a time. Her entire body weight, 108 pounds of bone, muscle, and terror pulled downward with the patient insistence of gravity. Her legs dangled uselessly below her, phantom sensations firing in nerves that hadn't worked in 7 years. She couldn't feel her feet, couldn't brace against anything, couldn't do what every survival instinct in her brain was screaming at her to do, climb. All she could do was hold on, and pray the root held longer than her strength. Time became fluid. Seconds stretched into hours. Hours collapsed into heartbeats. Andrea tried to count, tried to give herself something to focus on. Besides the pain, the blood, the 100-foot drop waiting patiently below her. 1, 2, 3. Her right hand slipped an inch. She gasped, tightening her grip, feeling fresh agony bloom as torn skin pressed against rough bark. The root shifted again, a sound like knuckles cracking, and Andrea's stomach lurched. 4, 5, 6. Her left shoulder screamed. The impact with the cliff face had done something to it. Torn muscle, separated joint, broken something vital. Every second she held on felt like that shoulder was being slowly pulled from its socket. 7, 8. Her hand slipped again. She was going to fall. Not might, not maybe. The simple mathematics of human endurance said she had minutes left, maybe less. Her forearms trembled violently, muscles exhausted past the point of function, operating now on adrenaline and animal stubbornness. But adrenaline ran out. And stubbornness didn't stop gravity. Andrea looked down. Mistake. The canyon floor spread out below her like an open mouth. Jagged rocks, bleached white by the sun, weighted with the patience of things that had been there for millennia and would be there for millennia more. A few twisted mesquite trees clung to impossible angles. A hawk circled somewhere far below, riding thermals Andrea couldn't feel. Beautiful, in a way. The last thing she'd ever see. She thought about Tia Rosa, who would come home from her shift at the diner and find Andrea's bedroom empty. How long would it take before Rosa thought to worry? Before she called someone? Before anyone came looking? Would they even find the body? Or would Andrea just become another story? Tierra Roja told itself the girl in the wheelchair who rolled too close to the edge and disappeared. Sad, unfortunate, inevitable really. When you thought about it, people like Andrea didn't get happy endings. They got forgotten, her vision blurred, blood loss or tears. She couldn't tell anymore. Everything hurt with such totality that individual injuries had merged into a single, all-consuming scream from her nervous system. The root groaned louder. Andrea felt it shift again, a sickening lurch that dropped her another half-inch before catching. Her scream was hoarse now, throat raw from the first one that had torn itself free when Mateo's boot connected with her chair. That felt like hours ago. How long had she been hanging here? 5 minutes? 50? Time had stopped meaning anything. There was only now this infinite, eternal moment of pain and fear and the slow certainty of falling. She tried to pull herself up one more time. Her arms refused. The muscles simply didn't respond anymore. She willed them to contract, to lift, to do something, and got nothing back except fresh waves of agony. This was it, then. This was how Andrea Ramon died. 17 years old, paralyzed, invisible, forgotten, kicked off a cliff by men who'd sleep fine tonight because they'd never see her as fully human anyway. She closed her eyes, started to let go. The sound came from below, boots on stone, not the slow crunch of someone hiking. Fast, purposeful, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Andrea's eyes snapped open. Up there, a voice, deep and rough, echoing off canyon walls. I see her. Hallucination, Andrea thought. Blood loss playing tricks. Her brain showing her mercy before the end. Get the rope. Another voice, this one closer. Move. Real voices didn't sound like that in hallucinations, did they? Andrea tried to look down, but her neck wouldn't cooperate. Everything was shutting down. Systems prioritizing survival over curiosity. Hold on, the first voice again. And this time Andrea felt the words more than heard them. Felt them travel through rock and air and settle into her chest like a command. I can't. Her voice came out as a whisper. Broken, defeated. The root shifted one final time. Andrea felt the last threads of wood separating from stone. She had seconds left. Then hands strong, certain, impossibly there, grabbed her wrists. I got you, the voice said. And it wasn't a promise or a hope. It was a fact. Andrea looked up and saw a man leaning over the cliff face. Suspended by ropes she couldn't process, his grip on her wrists absolute. Behind him, silhouetted against the burnt orange sky, another figure worked the rope system with professional efficiency. The man holding her had dark eyes that held no pity, no sympathy, just cold assessment of the situation and what needed to happen next. Let go of the root, he said. I'll fall. You'll fall if you don't. I'm not asking. The root cracked. Andrea let go. And the man pulled her up toward the light. She hit solid ground and collapsed, chest heaving, hands bleeding. A mind unable to process that she wasn't falling anymore, that she was alive. Above her, the man who'd pulled her up stood, brushing dust off a black suit jacket that had no business being in a desert canyon. Get her stabilized, he said to someone Andrea couldn't see. Then find the men who did this. His voice held no anger, just certainty, just consequence. Carlo Russo was 15 minutes late to a meeting that would decide who controlled the southern routes, and he didn't care. Death had a way of rearranging priorities. 40 minutes earlier, the black Escalade rolled through the canyon road at exactly 60 miles per hour, fast enough to matter, slow enough to control. Carlo sat in the back seat, reviewing numbers on his tablet. Shipment schedules, territory maps, the quiet mathematics of an empire built on fear and efficiency. His driver, Diego, navigated the turns with practiced ease. In the passenger seat, Renzo, Carlo's enforcer for the past 8 years, cleaned his nails with a folding knife, the picture of boredom. Vega's people will be waiting, Renzo said without looking up. You want to make them sweat? I want them ready to work, Carlo replied, not lifting his eyes from the screen. This isn't about posturing, it's about infrastructure. The territory meeting had been scheduled for weeks. 6 different families, all with stakes in the routes running through the canyon lands. Carlo controlled the largest share, but control was a living thing. It required constant feeding, constant attention. Miss one meeting, show one weakness. and the vultures started circling. Carlo Russo had survived 23 years in this business by understanding one fundamental truth. Power wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the most inevitable. He glanced out the window at the passing landscape. Rust-colored rock, skeletal trees, the kind of emptiness that made men philosophical or crazy, depending on their disposition. Carlo felt neither. He felt the scream cut through the air like a knife through silk. "Stop," Carlo said. Diego's foot hit the brake instantly. The Escalade slowed, tires crunching gravel. "Boss?" Renzo turned in his seat. Knife paused mid-cleaning. Carlo held up one hand, listening. Silence, desert wind, the distant cry of a hawk. Then there carried on the wind like a ghost. "Help me! Please help me!" Female. Young. Desperate. Something in Carlo's chest tightened. "Where's that coming from?" Diego scanned the landscape. The overlook. Renzo pointed toward a rise about 300 yards northeast. "That's Vega's territory. Could be." "Drive," Carlo said. "Now." The Escalade ate distance like a predator. Diego took the access road hard, suspension protesting, dust cloud rising behind them like smoke from a warning fire. Carlo's mind raced through possibilities, calculations, angles. Someone screaming on Vega's territory could mean turf war, could mean leverage, could mean a dozen things that required his immediate attention. But that wasn't why his jaw was tight. That wasn't why his hands had curled into fists. The scream. It sounded like her. 15 years ago. Carlo was 19 when his sister disappeared. Lucia, 14 years old, dark hair, bright eyes, a laugh that could fill a room and make even their father smile. She'd been walking home from school. 3 blocks. Safe neighborhood, or what passed for safe when your family made its money in blood and territory. She never made it home. They found her backpack 2 days later in an alley dumpster. Nothing else. No body. No witnesses. No leads. Carlo's father had burned half the city looking for answers. Found none. Lucia Russo became a ghost. A name on a memorial. A hole in Carlo's life that never filled. But he remembered her scream. The one from his nightmares. The one he invented because he'd never actually heard her die. And it sounded exactly like the voice cutting through the canyon air. The Escalade skidded to a stop at the overlook. Carlo was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped moving, his dress shoes hitting gravel, his eyes scanning the cliff edge. He saw them immediately. 2 men, early 30s, tattoos, work boots, the kind of low-level operators who thought cruelty was the same as strength. They stood near the edge, looking down into the canyon, shoulders relaxed, laughing. Carlo's vision tunneled. "Boss," Renzo started. "Rope," Carlo snapped. "Now." Diego was already moving, pulling emergency climbing gear from the rear compartment. Carlo's organization didn't deal in half measures. Every vehicle carried equipment for a dozen different scenarios. Extraction, disposal, rescue. This was rescue. Carlo stripped off his jacket, loosened his tie. "How far down?" Renzo peered over the edge. "Careful, professional. 40 feet. She caught something root or ledge. She's still alive." "How long?" "Minutes, maybe less." Carlo took the harness Diego handed him, stepping into it with practiced efficiency. He'd done this before, not rescues, but extractions. Bodies that needed retrieving, evidence that needed moving. Same skill set, different stakes. "Anchor point?" Carlo asked. Diego pointed to a boulder 10 feet back. "That'll hold. Make it fast." While his men secured the rope system, Carlo walked toward the 2 men at the cliff edge. They hadn't noticed the Escalade, hadn't heard it approach. Too busy congratulating themselves. Carlo stopped 5 feet behind them. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of iron wrapped in silk. Both men spun around. The laughter died on their faces. Recognition came slowly, first confusion, then understanding, then the particular kind of fear that arrives when you realize you've been standing in a lion's den without noticing. "Mr. Russo," the thicker one stammered. Matteo, Carlo's memory supplied. Worked for Vega's distribution network. Small-time muscle. The other, Javier, went pale. "There's a girl dying in that canyon," Carlo said. His voice held no inflection. No anger, just fact. "Tell me why." She," Matteo's mouth worked, but nothing coherent emerged. "She heard something," Javier blurted. "About the Thursday shipment. We were just handling it," Carlo finished. Javier nodded frantically. Carlo studied them both for a long moment. These men had kicked a disabled girl off a cliff, had stood here laughing while she screamed for help, had assumed their connection to Vega made them untouchable. They'd assumed wrong. "Boss," Diego called. "Ropes ready." Carlo turned without another word, walking back to where his men had prepared the descent system. "What about them?" Renzo asked quietly, nodding toward Matteo and Javier. "They stay here," Carlo said, stepping into the harness. "Don't let them leave." "Understood." Carlo checked the rope one final time, then walked to the cliff edge and looked down. He could see her now, small, broken, holding on with everything she had left. "I'm coming," Carlo called down, his voice cutting through the wind. Then he stepped backward off the cliff. Andrea didn't believe in salvation. She'd stopped believing in a lot of things after the accident that took her legs. God, justice, the fundamental goodness of people. But when strong hands grabbed her wrists and pulled her up from the void, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, the universe kept one miracle in reserve for the truly desperate. The man who saved her didn't look like a savior. He looked like violence in an expensive suit. Carlo Russo crouched beside Andrea on solid ground, his dark eyes scanning her for injuries with clinical precision. No warmth in that gaze, no pity, just assessment the way a mechanic might examine a damaged engine to determine what still worked. "Shoulders dislocated," he said to someone behind him. "Left side. Hands need immediate attention. Possible internal injuries from the initial impact." Andrea tried to speak. Her throat was sandpaper. Nothing came out but a weak rasp. "Don't talk." Carlo's voice held the authority of someone who expected obedience. "Diego, water, small sips." A younger man appeared, Latino, maybe 25, wearing a tactical vest over a black t-shirt. He crouched beside Andrea with a canteen, supporting her head with surprising gentleness as she drank. The water hit her system like salvation. Cool, clean, real. She was alive. The thought kept circling through her brain, unable to find purchase. "Alive. Still alive." "What's your name?" Carlo asked. "An Andrea." Her voice cracked. "Andrea Ramon." "Andrea." Carlo nodded once, as if filing the information somewhere permanent. "Who did this to you?" Andrea's eyes drifted past Carlo to where two figures stood frozen near the cliff edge. Matteo and Javier, their earlier confidence shattered, held in place by a mountain of a man with arms like bridge cables and a face that suggested he ate problems for breakfast. "Them," Andrea whispered. Carlo didn't turn around. Didn't need to. "Why?" I heard, Andrea coughed, lungs still remembering what it felt like to scream. "I heard them talking. About a shipment, Thursday night. I didn't mean to. I was just..." "Where?" "The school. Behind the maintenance shed." Carlo was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he stood in one fluid motion and walked toward Matteo and Javier with the measured pace of an executioner approaching the gallows. Andrea watched, unable to look away. Matteo had survived 29 years by reading rooms correctly. He was reading this one now, and every instinct he possessed was screaming the same message: run. But Renzo, the walking wall of muscle standing between them and any possible escape, didn't look like he'd break a sweat stopping them. And Carlo Russo was getting closer with every step. "Mr. Russo," Matteo started, forcing his voice steady. "This is just a misunderstanding. We were handling internal business. Vega's business. You know how it is. Tell me about Thursday," Carlo said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. Javier shot Matteo a look. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." "Just a regular run," Matteo said. "Standard shipment through the canyon routes. Nothing that concerns. You kicked a 17-year-old girl off a cliff because she overheard you discussing a regular run?" Carlo stopped 5 feet away. "That seemed proportional to you?" "She was a liability," Javier blurted. She heard specifics. Names. Routes. "We couldn't..." "Couldn't what?" "Trust a disabled girl to keep quiet." Carlo's voice dropped 10 degrees. "So you decided murder was cleaner?" "We were protecting the operation," Matteo insisted. Vega would have expected. "Vega," Carlo repeated the name like he was tasting it. "You think Vega's protection extends to attempted murder of civilians on my territory?" Matteo's stomach dropped. This is the Canyonlands. Vega's crew works this. "Through my permission," Carlo interrupted. "On my roads. Using my infrastructure. Which means anything that happens here happens with my awareness." The silence that followed was deafening. "Were you aware of this?" Carlo asked. Neither man answered. "I'll take that as no." Carlo clasped his hands behind his back. "So you took it upon yourselves to commit murder, in my territory, without clearance, without thinking about the complications, the exposure, the attention this brings. We were just..." "You were stupid," Carlo's words cut like surgical steel. Stupid enough to think no one would care. Stupid enough to throw a girl off a cliff in broad daylight. Stupid enough to laugh while she screamed. Mateo felt ice flood his veins. You weren't even supposed to be here. Carlo smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. No, I wasn't. I was late to a meeting, 15 minutes behind schedule. But I heard her scream. He took one step closer. Do you know what it's like to hear someone scream for help? Really scream, not in movies, not in stories, but in the raw panic of someone about to die. Neither man answered. It changes you, Carlo continued. Makes you remember things you'd rather forget. Makes you think about all the screams you didn't hear. The ones that happened when you weren't there to stop them. His voice went quiet. Lethal. I'm here now. Diego appeared at Carlo's side, discreet but present. Boss, the girl's stable. We should move her soon. Get her to a hospital. Agreed. Carlo didn't look away from Mateo and Javier. But first, these gentlemen are going to give us some information. We told you everything, Javier said quickly. Thursday shipment. Through the canyon. I don't care about the shipment. Carlo's interruption was precise. I care about names. Who else knew you were bringing Andrea here? Who gave the order? Who thought this was acceptable? Nobody ordered it, Mateo admitted. It was our call. Our problem to solve. Your problem, Carlo nodded slowly. So this was initiative. Freelance problem solving. We were trying to protect the operation. You were covering your own asses because you got sloppy, Carlo corrected. And now that sloppiness is my problem. He gestured to Renzo. Take them to the secondary location. I'll deal with them after I ensure the girl receives proper medical attention. No, wait, Mr. Russo, please. Mateo's voice cracked. Carlo finally turned to face him fully. The look in his eyes made Mateo wish he'd fallen off the cliff instead of Andrea. You threw a child into a canyon because you were afraid of consequences, Carlo said. Now you get to learn what consequences actually look like. He walked away. Renzo stepped forward. All business. Let's go, gentlemen. We've got a nice quiet place to continue this conversation. Carlo returned to where Andrea sat, wrapped now in Diego's jacket, shaking despite the desert heat. He knelt in front of her wheelchair. Diego had retrieved it from farther down the canyon, bent but functional. I heard you, Carlo said simply. Andrea looked up at him, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. Thank you, she whispered. Carlo stood. Don't thank me yet. We still have work to do. The secondary location was a mining shed 2 miles into the canyon, rusted, corrugated metal over stone foundation, built decades ago when Tierra Roja still believed in futures. Now it only housed endings. Mateo's hands were zip-tied behind his back, plastic cutting into his wrists with every movement. Javier sat beside him on the dirt floor, breathing too fast, eyes darting toward the door like a trapped animal calculating impossible escapes. Renzo stood against the far wall, arms crossed, face neutral. He'd seen this movie before, knew how it ended. The door opened. Carlo Russo stepped inside, and the temperature in the shed seemed to drop 10 degrees. He'd removed his tie, rolled up his sleeves. There was dirt on his shoes from kneeling beside Andrea, and somehow that detail made him more terrifying, the contrast between expensive fabric and canyon dust, between civilization and whatever was about to happen here. Carlo pulled up a folding chair and sat down directly in front of the 2 men, close enough to reach out and touch them, close enough that they could see every detail of his expression, calm, patient, inevitable. I'm going to ask questions, Carlo said. You're going to answer them. The quality of your answers will determine the quality of your immediate future. Understand? Both men nodded frantically. Good. Carlo leaned back slightly. Let's start simple. How long have you worked for Vega? 3 years, Mateo said quickly. Almost 4. Doing what? Distribution coordination? We manage local pickups, oversee transfers through the canyon routes to the depot. Who's your direct supervisor? Mateo hesitated. Carlo waited. Tomas Reyes, Mateo finally said. He runs the southern operations. Reyes. Carlo nodded. I know Tomas. Competent. Careful. Not the type to authorize what you did today. He didn't know, Javier blurted. We didn't tell him. We handled it. You handled it, Carlo repeated. Walk me through your thinking. Girl overhears a conversation. What made you decide murder was the appropriate response? She heard too much, Mateo said. Dates, routes, names. If she talked to who? Carlo interrupted. The police? Sheriff's department is 40 miles away and doesn't care about canyon business. Her family? Her aunt works double shifts at a diner. Who exactly did you think this disabled teenager was going to run to? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. You didn't think, Carlo continued. That's the problem. You reacted, got scared, made a decision that brought heat, attention, and complication to an operation that functioned precisely because it stayed invisible. We were trying to protect. You were trying to protect yourselves. Carlo cut him off. Because if Reyes found out you'd been careless enough to discuss operational details in public, near a witness, you'd face consequences. So you decided to eliminate the witness instead of facing your supervisor. The accuracy of the statement hit Matteo like a physical blow. Carlo leaned forward. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me every detail of Thursday's shipment. Where it's coming from, where it's going, who else is involved, what's being moved, everything. Mr. Russo, if Vega finds out we talked, Vega's going to find out you tried to commit murder on my territory, Carlo said. The question is whether he finds out from me or from someone else. Which conversation do you think goes better for you? Neither man had an answer for that. Start talking, Carlo said. It took 40 minutes. Matteo spoke first, voice shaking, words tumbling over each other in the desperate rush of a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. Routes, schedules, shipment contents, medical supplies diverted from legitimate channels, prescription medications bound for black markets 3 states away. Javier filled in the gaps. Names of other crew members, payment structures, the location of the depot where goods were transferred to long-haul trucks. Carlo listened without interruption, his expression never changing. Renzo took notes on a small pad, his handwriting precise despite the failing light filtering through the shed's gaps. When they finally ran out of information, silence settled like dust. Is that everything? Carlo asked. Yes, Matteo said. I swear. That's everything we know. Carlo studied them both for a long moment. You understand what you've done here? We told you what you wanted, Javier said. We cooperated. You've confessed to theft, trafficking, and attempted murder, Carlo corrected. You've implicated yourselves and your entire crew. You've given me leverage over Vega's southern operations. The realization hit them simultaneously. But you said, Matteo started. I said your answers would determine your future, Carlo interrupted. I didn't promise that future would be pleasant. He stood, brushing dust from his pants. Mr. Russo, please. Javier's voice cracked. We told you everything. We cooperated. You can't. Can't what? Carlo turned back to face them. Can't hold you accountable? Can't ensure you face consequences for throwing a child off a cliff? We were just following the rules, Matteo shouted. The way things work out here. You know how it is, some people matter and some people don't. That's the game. That's how everyone plays it. Carlo went very still. You're right, he said quietly. That is how the game works. Some people matter. Some people are weight you cut loose when it's convenient. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. The girl mattered, Carlo said. I heard her scream. I pulled her up from that cliff. Which means she matters to me now. He looked back over his shoulder. You don't. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the canyon rim. Diego stood beside the Escalade, phone pressed to his ear, coordinating Andrea's transport to the nearest hospital with actual equipment. Carlo emerged from the shed, rolled down his sleeves, and walked toward the vehicle. What do you want to do with them? Renzo asked, following close behind. Carlo was quiet for several steps. When he spoke, his voice carried no emotion, no anger, just the cold arithmetic of consequence. The canyon's already taken one person today, Carlo said. Might as well feed it properly. Renzo nodded. And Vega? I'll handle Vega personally. He'll understand. Carlo opened the Escalade door. This was about principle, about rules, about what happens when his people operate without oversight. And the girl? Carlo paused, one foot in the vehicle. Make sure she gets the best care available. Private room, security, everything. She'll have questions. Then we'll answer them. Carlo slid into the back seat. She survived today because someone heard her scream. I'm going to make sure she survives tomorrow, because someone's still listening. The door closed. Renzo returned to the shed, where 2 men waited to learn what the canyon already knew. Some screams echo. Some don't. The canyon had witnessed 1,000 deaths before Mateo Ruiz and Javier Soto. It would witness 1,000 more after. But none quite like this. Renzo returned to the shed with the same measured pace he'd carried all day, efficient, professional, unburdened by doubt. This was work. Work had procedures. Matteo looked up when the door opened, hope flickering in his eyes like a candle in wind. Mr. Russo changed his mind? No, Renzo said simply. The hope died. Please, Javier whispered. We have families. People who… The girl you kicked off a cliff had family too, Renzo interrupted. He pulled out a folding knife, and both men flinched. But he only cut their zip ties, letting their hands fall free. Stand up. They stood on shaking legs. Walk. Where? Matteo's voice cracked. Does it matter? They walked. The path back to the overlook took 12 minutes. Renzo followed 3 steps behind, close enough to prevent escape, far enough to let them feel the weight of what was coming. Matteo tried once to run. He made it 4 steps before Renzo's hand clamped on his shoulder like a vice, spinning him around and slamming him against a boulder with enough force to crack ribs. Walk, Renzo repeated. Matteo walked. Javier had stopped even considering escape. His face had gone gray, skin slick with sweat despite the cooling evening air. He moved like a man in a dream, feet shuffling forward on autopilot, while his mind screamed at him to wake up. This couldn't be happening. They were supposed to be untouchable, protected, part of something bigger than themselves. But standing at the overlook now, staring at the same cliff edge they'd pushed Andrea over hours earlier, Javier understood with brutal clarity. There was no such thing as untouchable. There was only power, and they'd never had it. You know what you did here, Renzo said. Not a question, a statement. Neither man answered. You stood on this spot, Renzo continued, and you kicked a 17-year-old girl into the void. You laughed while she screamed. You turned around and walked away believing you'd gotten away with it. We didn't know, Matteo started. Didn't know she'd survive? Didn't know Mr. Russo would hear her? Didn't know there would be consequences? Renzo shook his head. What you didn't know was that your protection ended the moment you made this personal. How is this personal? Javier demanded, voice cracking with hysteria. We don't even know that girl. We were just… It became personal when Mr. Russo decided it was personal, Renzo said. That's how power works. You should understand that. You used your power, your connection to Vega, your physical strength, your mobility to victimize someone weaker. Now someone with more power than you is doing the same thing. The logic was airtight. The logic was horrifying. This isn't justice, Matteo said desperately. This is murder. No, Renzo corrected. What you did to Andrea was attempted murder. This is consequence. He gestured toward the cliff edge. Walk. Matteo dropped to his knees. Please, please, I'm begging you. I'll do anything. I'll disappear. I'll leave the state. You'll never hear from me again. I swear on my mother's grave. Your mother's alive, Renzo said. Lives in Albuquerque, works at a laundromat, has a small dog named Peso. The casual knowledge, the implication that Carlo Russo's organization knew everything about them, down to their families, their habits, their weak points, hit Matteo like a gut punch. If you kill us, Vega will understand, Renzo interrupted. Because Mr. Russo will explain that you acted without authorization, that you created exposure, that you brought heat to an operation that worked because it stayed quiet. Vega's a businessman. He understands when assets become liabilities. Javier made a sound, half sob, half laugh. We're already dead. Yes, Renzo agreed. You died the moment you kicked that wheelchair. Everything since has just been paperwork. He pulled out his phone, checked something, then pocketed it again. Mr. Russo wanted me to give you a choice, quick or slow. Mercy or justice. What's the difference? Matteo asked. Quick. I shoot you both. Fast. Relatively painless. You're gone before you hit the rocks. Neither man spoke. Slow. You jump. Experience exactly what Andrea experienced. The fall. The terror. The certainty of death approaching. Then the rocks. That's not a choice, Javier whispered. Neither was what you gave Andrea, Renzo said. But Mr. Russo is more merciful than you were. He's offering options. Silence stretched between them, broken only by wind whistling through canyon gaps and the distant cry of a hawk. How long do we have? Matteo finally asked. To decide? Now. Renzo pulled a pistol from his waistband, checked the chamber. To live? About 30 seconds either way. In the end, neither man chose. Fear paralyzed them, both legs locked, minds fractured, bodies refusing to cooperate with decisions their consciousness couldn't process. Renzo waited 15 seconds. Then he raised the pistol. Wait, Javier started. The shot echoed across the canyon, and Javier's body pitched backward over the edge, gravity claiming him before surprise could register on his face. Matteo screamed. Renzo turned the gun toward him. "Please, God, please." "God's not here," Renzo said. "Just us. Just consequence." The second shot was quieter somehow. Or maybe Matteo's ears were ringing too loud to hear it properly. He felt the impact chest, center mass, professional placement, and then he was falling. The irony wasn't lost on him, even as his mind shut down. He'd thrown Andrea into this same void. Now the void had him instead. The rocks rose up to meet him with patient, ancient indifference. Renzo stood at the edge for a moment longer, watching the bodies settle into the canyon floor far below. He holstered his weapon, pulled out his phone, and dialed. "It's done," he said when Carlo answered. "Clean?" "As requested." "Good. How's the girl?" Renzo checked his watch. Diego reported she's stable. Hospital's prepared a private wing. Security's in place. "I want updates every hour." "Understood." Carlo was quiet for a moment. "Renzo?" "Yes, boss?" Did they understand why? Renzo looked back at the canyon. "I think so." "At the end?" "Good." Carlo disconnected. Renzo pocketed his phone and walked back to the Escalade, where Diego waited with the engine running. Behind him, the canyon settled back into silence. It had taken two more. It would remember neither. But somewhere in a hospital 40 miles away, a girl named Andrea Ramon would wake up tomorrow still breathing. And that was the only calculation that mattered. Andrea woke to white ceiling tiles and the steady beep of machines she couldn't see. For 3 perfect seconds, she didn't remember. Then her hands bandaged, aching, screaming with every small movement reminded her. The canyon, the fall, the men who'd laughed while she died, the man who'd pulled her back. Easy. A voice, female and calm. A nurse appeared in Andrea's peripheral vision, adjusting something on an IV pole. "You're in St. Catherine's Hospital. You're safe. Don't try to move too fast." Andrea's throat felt like she'd swallowed gravel. How long?" "You've been here about 6 hours. They brought you in around sunset, treated you for shock, dehydration, blood loss, reset your shoulder, stitched up your hands." The nurse her name tag read. Maria smiled gently. "You're lucky to be alive." Lucky. The word felt obscene. Andrea closed her eyes, and immediately she was back there hanging from the root, fingers slipping, death waiting below with patient certainty. "Hey." Maria's hand on her arm, warm and steady. "You're safe now, I promise. There are people outside making sure of it." "What people?" "Security. Private security. They've been here since you arrived. Very serious men who don't smile much." Maria lowered her voice. "One of them looks like he bench presses refrigerators for fun." Despite everything, Andrea almost laughed. "Renzo. Had to be." "Where's—" Andrea stopped. She didn't know his name. The man in the black suit who'd heard her scream, who'd descended into the canyon like some kind of avenging angel. "Where's the man who brought me here?" "He didn't stay," Maria said. "But he left instructions. Very specific instructions about your care. Also left this." She handed Andrea a card, simple, expensive cardstock with embossed lettering. "Carlo Russo. Private consultation. A phone number. Nothing else. He said to call when you were ready," Maria explained. "No rush. When you were ready." His emphasis. Andrea stared at the card. Carlo Russo. So that was his name. The man who'd saved her life was named Carlo Russo. The man who'd made Matteo and Javier disappear. Because they had disappeared. Andrea was certain of it. She'd seen the look in Carlo's eyes. Heard the way he'd spoken to them. That wasn't the voice of someone planning to file police reports. That was the voice of someone who solved problems permanently. "What time is it?" Andrea asked. "Almost midnight." "My Aunt Tia Rosa, does she know I'm here?" Maria's expression softened. "We called the number from your phone. She's on her way. Should be here within the hour." Relief flooded Andrea's system so suddenly it hurt. Rosa was coming. Rosa would know what to do. Rosa always knew what to do. Except this time Andrea wasn't sure there was anything to do. What had happened in that canyon existed outside the normal rules. Outside police and lawyers and the systems that were supposed to protect people like Andrea, Carlo Russo operated in different territory entirely. The nightmares came in waves. Between bouts of fitful sleep, Andrea would jolt awake, heart hammering, hands clutching at blankets that her damaged nerves registered as stone and root and air. The fall played on loop behind her eyelids. The moment of suspension before gravity took over. The certainty of death. The scream that had saved her life. Around 3 a.m, Rosa arrived. She burst into the room like a force of nature, 63 years old, 5'2", wearing her diner uniform and carrying the smell of coffee and fryer oil and unconditional love. "Mija," Rosa gasped, rushing to the bedside. Her hands hovered over Andrea, afraid to touch, afraid to hurt. "Dios mío, what happened?" "They said the hospital said A. Andrea." "I'm okay," Andrea whispered, even though it was a lie. "You're not okay, look at you. Your hands, your shoulder." Rosa's voice cracked. "Who did this? Who hurt you?" Andrea opened her mouth, closed it. How did she explain? "Bad men," she finally said. "But they're gone now." "Gone? What does that mean, gone? Did the police—" "Not police," Andrea interrupted quietly. "Someone else." Rosa's expression shifted from fear to something more complicated. She'd lived in Tierra Roja her whole life. She understood what someone else meant in towns like theirs. "Mija," Rosa said carefully, "what have you gotten involved in?" "I didn't get involved in anything," Andrea said, tears finally spilling over. "I just heard something I wasn't supposed to hear, and they tried to kill me for it. They kicked me off a cliff. Tia, they kicked my wheelchair off a cliff and laughed while I fell." Rosa made a sound like she'd been struck. She pulled Andrea carefully into a hug, mindful of injuries, and Andrea collapsed into her aunt's arms the way she'd wanted to collapse ever since strong hands had pulled her up from the canyon. She cried, sobbed, let out days of fear and weeks of isolation and 17 years of being invisible until visibility nearly killed her. Rosa held her through all of it, murmuring prayers and promises in Spanish, rocking her like she was 7 years old again instead of 17. When Andrea finally had no tears left, Rosa pulled back, wiping Andrea's face with gentle hands. "Tell me everything," Rosa said. "Start from the beginning." So Andrea did. She told Rosa about the conversation behind the maintenance shed, about Mateo and Javier's eyes on her for days afterward, about the truck ride to the canyon and the terrible certainty that she was going to die and no one would care. She told her about the fall, about catching the root, about screaming until her throat bled, and she told her about Carlo Russo. Rosa listened without interruption, her face growing harder with each detail. When Andrea finished, Rosa sat back in her chair, processing. "This Carlo Russo," Rosa finally said. "You're sure that's who saved you?" "That's what his card says." "And the men? Mateo and Javier?" Andrea met her aunt's eyes. "Gone. Really gone." Rosa was quiet for a long moment. "There will be questions," she said. "People will notice they're missing. Will anyone care?" The question hung between them, brutal, honest, accurate. Rosa sighed. "No, probably not. So what do I do?" "You heal," Rosa said firmly. "You recover. You survive. That's what you do." And then, Rosa picked up Carlo Russo's card from the bedside table, studying it like it might bite her. "Then we figure out what kind of debt we owe a man like this. Because men like him don't save people for free. Mija. They save people because it serves them." "He said he heard me," Andrea whispered. "He said my scream reminded him of someone." "Then maybe," Rosa said slowly, "he saved you for reasons that have nothing to do with you at all." The thought should have been unsettling. Instead, Andrea found it oddly comforting. She hadn't been saved because she was special or important or worthy. She'd been saved because she'd screamed at exactly the right moment, and the right person had been close enough to hear. Luck, coincidence, the universe's arithmetic balancing out in her favor for once. She'd take it. 3 weeks after the canyon, Andrea returned to Tierra Roja. The town looked exactly the same, sun-bleached buildings, cracked streets, dust settling into every crevice like it had given up trying to leave. But Andrea had changed. The physical wounds healed faster than expected. Her shoulder took 2 weeks of physical therapy before the range of motion returned. Her hands wrapped in bandages that made gripping her wheelchair difficult slowly knitted themselves back together, scar tissue forming pink and permanent across her palms. Proof she'd held on. Proof she'd survived. The nightmares took longer. Some nights she still woke up gasping, hands clutching at sheets, body convinced it was falling. Rosa would appear in the doorway, sleepy but alert, and sit with Andrea until the terror passed. "It gets easier," Rosa promised. Andrea wasn't sure she believed her. But she was learning that survival wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about functioning despite it. About rolling forward even when your hands shook and your breath caught and your mind whispered that the ground beneath you might disappear any second. The first day back at school, Andrea rolled through the front entrance expecting stares. She got silence instead. Students moved through hallways like always talking, laughing, existing in their own small dramas. But when Andrea passed, Conversations paused. Eyes dropped. People made space. They knew. Somehow, the town knew. Mateo and Javier had disappeared, vanished like smoke. Their families had reported them missing. Search parties had looked for 3 days before quietly giving up. No bodies, no leads, no explanations, just absence. And Andrea visible now in ways she'd never been before, rolling through school like a ghost that had come back wrong. Miss Delgado stopped her after history class. "Andrea," the teacher said carefully, "if you need time, if you need to talk to someone, the school can arrange." "I'm fine," Andrea said. Miss Delgado's expression suggested she didn't believe that, but she nodded anyway. "If you change your mind, my door's always open." Andrea rolled away before the conversation could become something she'd have to navigate. At lunch, she took her usual spot alone, near the far wall, where shade fell longest. She unwrapped Rosa's tortilla, still warm, still soft. Halfway through eating, someone approached. A girl from her grade, Lucia Santos, quiet, artistic, someone Andrea had never actually spoken to, stood beside Andrea's table with a tray of food and an uncertain expression. "Can I sit here?" Lucia asked. Andrea blinked. "Why?" "Because you're sitting alone, and I'm sitting alone. Seems inefficient." It was such a practical answer that Andrea almost smiled. "Sure," she said. Lucia sat. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes before Lucia spoke again. "I heard what happened," she said quietly. "With Mateo and Javier." Andrea's hands tightened around her tortilla. "What did you hear?" "That they hurt you. That someone made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else." Andrea waited. "I'm glad," Lucia continued, "that someone helped you. That you're okay." "I'm not sure I'm okay," Andrea admitted. "But you're here. That's more okay than the alternative." It was hard to argue with that logic. They finished lunch together. Lucia told Andrea about her art project, a mural proposal for the school entrance that probably wouldn't get approved. Andrea told Lucia about physical therapy and how her hands still cramped when she gripped things too tight. Normal conversation. Easy conversation. The kind Andrea had never had at this school. When the bell rang, Lucia stood, picked up her tray, and looked down at Andrea. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. "Yeah," Andrea said. "Same time." Lucia walked away, and Andrea sat there for a moment longer, processing. She'd made a friend. After 17 years of invisibility, after nearly dying on a canyon cliff, after being saved by a man who solved problems with permanent solutions, she'd made a friend by simply existing in the same space. It felt like a miracle. It felt like proof that survival could lead to something beyond just surviving. That evening, Andrea sat in her bedroom, small, cluttered with medical supplies and abandoned homework, and stared at Carlo Russo's card. She'd carried it every day since the hospital, kept it in her pocket like a talisman, like proof that what had happened in the canyon was real and not some fever dream her traumatized brain had invented. 3 weeks, he'd said to call when she was ready. Was she ready? Andrea didn't know, but she picked up her phone anyway. The number rang 4 times before someone answered. "This is Russo." His voice, even through phone static, carried that same weight, that same certainty. "It's Andrea," she said. "Andrea Ramon." A pause. "Andrea, how are you healing?" "My hands still hurt. Physical therapy's working. Nightmares are getting better." She paused. "I wanted to say thank you. Properly. Not just I know I said it at the canyon. But I don't think I really understood." "You don't owe me thanks," Carlo interrupted. "I heard you scream," I responded. "That's all." "It's not all," Andrea said. "You saved my life. You made sure Mateo and Javier couldn't hurt anyone else. You paid for my hospital care. I did what needed to be done." His tone suggested the conversation was over. But Andrea wasn't finished. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you help me? You said my scream reminded you of someone. Who?" Another pause. Longer this time. "My sister," Carlo finally said. "Lucia. She disappeared 15 years ago. I never found her. Never found who took her. Never got to." He stopped. "Your scream sounded like how I imagined hers would have sounded. If anyone had been close enough to hear." Andrea felt something crack open in her chest. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. You survived. That's enough." "Is it?" Andrea asked. "Is survival enough when the world just keeps when people like Mateo and Javier exist and hurt people and no one stops them until someone does," Carlo finished. "Yes, that's how it works. The world doesn't fix itself, Andrea. It requires intervention. Choice. People deciding that certain things won't be tolerated. And you decided I wouldn't be tolerated as a victim. I decided you'd been victimized enough. The distinction felt important somehow. What happens now? Andrea asked. Now you heal. You go back to school. You live your life. You don't let fear make you small. And if I'm still scared? Then you're scared, Carlo said simply. But you move forward anyway. That's what survival looks like. Andrea sat with that for a moment. Will I see you again? Do you want to? She didn't have an answer ready. Part of her wanted to never think about the canyon, Carlo Russo, or the violence that had saved her ever again. Part of her understood that Carlo represented something important, proof that power could be wielded for protection instead of cruelty. I don't know, she admitted. Then call when you do know, Carlo said. This number works whenever you need it. Even if I never need it? Even then. The line disconnected. Andrea sat holding her phone, staring at the card, thinking about screams that echo and the people who hear them. That night, Andrea dreamed, but not of falling. She dreamed of standing at the canyon's edge, not as a victim pushed, but as a survivor who'd crawled back. The wind caught her hair. The sun warmed her face. Behind her, voices called Rosa, Lucia, even Carlo Russo's steady certainty. Ahead of her, the canyon opened wide and endless, and Andrea didn't fall. She rolled forward instead. 6 months after the canyon, Andrea Ramon sat at graduation, 23 students total, wearing rented gowns that smelled like mothballs and optimism. Principal Morales called her name. The applause was loud, genuine. Andrea rolled across the stage, accepted her diploma, and looked out at the small crowd. Rosa was crying. Lucia was cheering. Miss Delgado was smiling. And in the back, standing against the wall in a black suit, barely visible, Carlo Russo nodded once. Andrea nodded back. Then she rolled off the stage and into whatever came next. She'd survived the fall. Now she'd learned to fly. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.